You claiming gang, gang, gang? Wait till you see your man get bang, bang, bang. I'm a 90s baby. I grew up with Bloods, Crips, Vice Lords, and Latin Kings who carried them things. Too many funerals, you think COVID was last year's pain. Survivor's guilt is the way I live. Seen so many bodies drop like flies and HIV. Gang, gang, gang. Watch them words that you use, or the next rhyme I write might be about you.
The journey of knowing thyself begins in the cradle and ends in the grave. One way to capture those moments of ourself can be found in the shelf. Shelves have been around since the creation of ancient scrolls. My name is Dr. Walter Hidalgo, and I'm a father, teacher, world traveler, and coach. Join me as we explore together the stories of our shelves. This is Know Thyself.
Watch this.
Peace, 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 beautiful family. This is Dr. Walter Hidalgo, and this is the Know Thyself podcast. And I'm humbled and happy to be here with you all today as we explore another meaning and understanding of what it means to know thyself. Shout out to all the single parents out there. I don't think we give them the flowers that they deserve. It's a beautiful thing when, you know, we talk about folks being in the front lines and working really hard out there as we continue to struggle and wrestle with this monster. I also, unfortunately, want to say rest in peace to Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. Definitely, you know, something again, you know, I mentioned this on my Instagram. We reaching the summer, and it just seems like every single time it starts to get warm, we start to see high incidents of this happen, police brutality. And it's extremely unfortunate, right? But I'm gonna save that for another podcast, another date. I also wanna say shout out to everybody that's listening on Facebook Live and everywhere in the world. The Know Thyself podcast utilizes the metaphor of the shelf to extrapolate the self. I want to jump into gangs. Tekashi 6ix9ine just got released, millions of views. Young people are looking at this and all they're hearing is gang, gang, gang. I want to give a brief history about gangs. Gangs go back a long time ago. One of the first known gangs here in New York was in the 19th century. They were called the 40 Thieves. And they made up of mostly Irish. And due to the potato famine, they came and they settled in the Five Points neighborhood. If you ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, it's a great depiction of not only migration in the 19th century, but it also showed gang culture. It's really fascinating, interesting. But gang culture is not limited to one ethnicity, one group, and one time. The Mafia, the Triads, Latin Kings, Crips, Bloods, Nietas, even Five Percenters, some would even argue the Zulu Nation were all gangs. Not all gangs were bad. There were reasons why gangs came into fruition. They came together to protect themselves. They came together because of the situations and circumstances that were happening in the neighborhood. What resulted in people living in poverty, like the Irish in the 19th century, like the African Americans in Los Angeles that ended up forming the Crips, the Latin Kings in Chicago, right? The Nietas, all these gangs, everything that came about was a direct result of the social economical realities of their times. So gangs is a direct result of what's happening in our community right now. So not all gangs were negative. As a matter of fact, the Crips actually stood for community resistance and progress. Some would argue that some of the initiatives from the Crips were actually good in nature. The Latin Kings actually were formed to help the Latino community, and they grew out in Chicago, but at the same time they were very engaged politically. They were in rallies. There were so many things that were happening around that time that they ended up organizing and coming back together. So this idea of how Tekashi portrays gang culture with these guns, with this large groups of people. If you've ever been associated with gangs, you understand that they roll deep because there's powers in numbers. And what happens when there's powers in numbers is that you see this abuse happen. You see violence happen. I remember growing up, going to parties, I would just be a couple of friends of mine, right? But eventually, some gang folks would show up, and they show up in numbers, as we say, deep, rolling in MPVs, as the Wu-Tang would say. And as a result, I myself witnessed a lot of violence. Violence that consisted of everything from homicide, robberies, abuse towards women, extortion, money laundering. And those are the same things that a certain individual that I was speaking to of earlier was indicted for, right? Tekashi 6ix9ine. Because they wanted to portray this gang culture. And what happens is that it ends up creating these ripple effects that we don't end up talking about. The 90s was a huge gang era. I was born in the 80s, but I grew up in the 90s. And I bear witness to a lot of violence. And it's sad that, our young people are only seeing on a superficial level, on a face level, what's happening with gang culture. The homicide rates, in Chicago, you understand, y'all heard the story before. We don't talk about how friendships were destroyed, how families were destroyed, how relationships were tarnished as a result of gang culture. Not everything that perceived on a surface level with these cars and flashy bandanas and these tribes, right? It created fear, it created anxiety, and really, I want to speak on the survivor's guilt and provide y'all with some tools and some things that you can get out of this as it relates to gang culture, because I myself have suffered from survivor's guilt. And given the circumstances that we're all in, there's going to be another wave of people that are going to experience survivor's guilt. The guilt of seeing a friend die, or not being able to see a friend die at the hospital, right, because of COVID. Not being able to see that aunt or a family member at the funeral at another state because they can't travel because a family member passed away. Or the domestic violence that has continued to escalate as a result. All things that are continuing to add to trauma. Trauma that is associated with survivor's guilt. And what is survivor's guilt? Essentially is feeling guilt of surviving. That's what it is, family. But the reality is that the reason I'm here today is because I never really was in a gang, ever. But I was affiliated with gang members. And my affiliation opened a lot of doors for me. Stories that I will not speak on here publicly. So it's either the people that you see that are real from the hood, that come from that gang culture or understand what it's really about, It's either that they were affiliated with a gang or they got really, really lucky and survived it. And when you survive that and you don't cope with it really well, you experience guilt, anger, sadness, regret. Whether you participated in that gang action or you were a witness to it, that stays in your psyche. And that has ripple effects in your relationships and how you perceive humanity and how we move and navigate in this world, right? Me seeing guys run trains on women and seeing how they disrespect women, that's the other piece, right? And that does something to the psyche of a man, particularly how he treats a woman. If we objectified women in that way and they see it in the gang culture, how do you think that's going to be when that individual becomes a man or a woman? That's very real talk. I want to jump into solutions of survivor's guilt, and I want us to consider utilizing the elements of hip hop. Why? Because what people don't understand is that in reality, the structure of hip hop, the foundation of hip hop came from gang culture, right? But when all the gangs of New York came together, they put their weapons down, right? And converted those knives, those guns, and all that stuff to hip hop. And I want us young people, us parents, to consider utilizing hip hop to your young person to free them of survivor's guilt. How? How, Walter? Let's consider one of the elements of hip hop, DJing. The element of DJing is basically sonic alchemy, the creation of music. Producing music is alchemy, creating nothing into something. That's hip hop. Why don't we channel that dark hole, that nothingness, that anger that I seen a lot in gang culture, right, into something positive, right? A sound. Create music. Produce music. Consider picking up, the turntables and being a DJ. I know a lot of my friends that were former gang members that are now DJs. And the same goes out in the mainstream as well, right? Consider MCing. Shout out to all the hip-hop therapy organizations out there. Hip-hop psychology. I was invited to one of the first hip-hop and psychology conferences in the country at Fordham University. It was facilitated by Dr. Tyson, rest in peace. And it was powerful because the use of poetry, identifying the words, the anger, the positivity that come from gang members, right, can be used, can be transformed, can be put into words and sound. When you hear yourself, right, it does something to the psyche. It empowers. Graffiti. There were some in the culture that put the gun down, the knife down, the anger down, and picked up the aerosol can. Do art. Consider doing art. I tell it's not a coincidence that many people that used to tag or bomb, we call it when you're vandalizing, they're now artists. Their artwork is now being exhibited in the Bronx Museum right now. We got the hip hop museum that's starting to open in the Bronx now, where we're now displaying what was considered vandalism from gangs. My brother and my sister, consider putting down that gun, that chain, that anger, and pick up that aerosol can. Do art. It's one of the elements. Breakdancing. It's funny because I remember, the dance, the Crip Walk. You know what I'm saying? Why can't we walk a different way? Why can't we dance instead of having war against each other? Why don't we dance? You know what I'm saying? Have parties more. Of course, there was a lot of conflict that happened when gangs got together in some instances, but I would say If you're a dancer and you're in a gang or considering being in a gang, consider the dancing route. There's a lot more opportunities there. Super facts, right? Fifth one, knowledge. Plain and simple, family. Malcolm X was transformed in prison. The real ones that were in gangs, like I said, are either dead or in prison. Or the lucky ones, or the affiliated ones. That's me. But Malcolm X gained knowledge of self in prison. And hip hop is very much about gaining knowledge of self. If you don't know how to read, pick a dictionary. Go back to school. Consider the alternative. Instead of dying for your block, why don't you learn about your block? Be more conscious. Read more. Take this opportunity. If you're a gang member now or a former gang member, consider knowledge of self. The other thing I want to say to wrap us up before we wrap up is the spiritual side of things. One way we could survive survivor's guilt is consider memorializing those we lost. Consider maybe creating a mural or an altar to remember those people that we lost. Survivor's guilt is very real. It's something that we carry inside of ourselves. It's how we learn how to pray. When we tell someone that we're sorry or forgive me, right? It's how we channel to our ancestors when we consider memorializing people instead of having this guilt. And the last thing is, instead of joining a gang, why don't you join the other gang? That other gang is Stopping Police Brutality gang, the Equal Rights gang. They're trying to reform our schools gang. To close us, this is from an anonymous person. The quote reads as such: "Non-violence doesn't always work, but violence never works." Peace, family.
TikTok, cause when my shit spark, dudes are sliding off like the crip walk. But back to how you rapping, dude. And when you bragging on the track, it's an act and it's lacking truth. And you gon' need a rosary from listening to these rappers, how they lie about their own street. What's the matter for you?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to our most recent episode of Know Thy Shelf. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. I also want you to know that Know Thy Shelf is not just about conversations, but we're also about solutions. I've been teaching, coaching, and counseling youth and young adults from all over the world for almost 15 years. If you or your child is suffering from anger, anxiety, depression, survivor's guilt, we are offering online coaching for youth and young adults from ages 10 and above. Please email us at knowthyshelftv@gmail.com to receive a free consultation, and from there we can set up an online coaching package for your child or for yourself. On behalf of the Know Thy Shelf community, we say peace and God bless.